Saturday Morning Physics is sponsored by the M. Lois Tiffany Endowment, the Hideko Tomazawa Endowment, the Physics Department, and by gifts from friends of the program.
First of all, I'll give you, this is the overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll start with trying to set the tone by giving you a frame of reference, at least a frame of reference I think that I'm using when I do this research, when we're engaged in the research that I'm going to talk about. Then I'll tell you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different stories, each one of which takes about, 20 minutes or so we'll be out of here in a couple of hours. And then finally, I'll wind up with just a couple of statements about non-Newtonian ecology. You'll see what that means in just a moment. Now, the frame of reference, I'm going to start with saying a few words about coffee, then a few words about Newton, and finally about Henri Poincaré. Coffee. Okay, the first question everybody asks, why do you work in coffee? Why is coffee important? And there's a variety of answers to that. The most obvious one is that. Now, some of you may have seen last year, or was it earlier this year, in the New York Times, and one of the editorials by that wonderful editorialist, is it Charles Bittman? I think so, in the New York Times, where he quotes somebody. I can't remember who he quotes, and I can't read it on my screen, so I'm going to have to read it here. Great coffee is this amazing miracle. Its warm deliciousness in the morning transforms even the most rough-edged of us into intelligent, sparkling, upstanding men and women. I'm sure some of you at least can identify with that statement. So, a little bit about the practical importance of coffee. First of all, of course, it does make us intelligent, sparkling, and upstanding. But second of all, and perhaps more important, it's second only to petroleum in international commerce. Now, there's an asterisk there, and now this is an in-joke. This asterisk represents an in-joke for anybody here who happens to, like I do, Stephen Colbert. And you remember what Senator Kyle said earlier this year about Planned Parenthood, and then you remember what his office said. So, for years I used to cite that second only to petroleum in international commerce, which I didn't invent the statement. I read it somewhere else, and then I was challenged by an economist just 2 years ago, I think. And he pointed out that it all depends on how you actually make the calculations, right? And you can make them this way or that way, a variety of different things, like, you know, the economists do, econometricians, they have magic that they do. And, well, it's not right, okay? But it's not meant to be a factual statement. But it does make the point that coffee really is important in international trade, and at least some people think it's second only to petroleum. That's not true, but it's still, nevertheless, it's very, very important. But now, in a more serious tone, it is a refuge for tropical biodiversity, and thus it's of conservation concern, and there's no doubt about that. And finally, and to my mind at least even more important, is the livelihood for millions of small farmers. So anything that one can do in understanding how coffee is produced and understanding its ecology will potentially at least help those millions of small farmers. So that's the practical importance. Now getting on to the sort of a theoretical importance as a scientist, as an ecologist, for me it has theoretical importance also. It's an ecosystem which is replicated around the world. That is, it's as if somebody had set up a large experiment, worldwide experiment for me to study. It has a relatively uniform underlying structure, so it represents kind of replicates around the world. And then it has these systematic ways of modifying the production system, which almost look like somebody doing an experiment. You have shade coffee versus non-shade coffee. You have organic coffee versus non-organic coffee. You have a variety of other production technologies that make the coffee agro-ecosystem effectively an experimental tool. So for me, the coffee agro-ecosystem is what Drosophila is to geneticists. It's the model organism that I use in order to study the dynamics of ecological systems. And what I'm going to be talking to you about today is those ecological dynamics. I have another set of talks that I give about sort of the politics and economics of coffee too. That's not what I'm going to talk about today. Okay, now, as you all know, Isaac Newton was the father of ecology. Okay, that's a joke, and you're supposed to chuckle, yes. But it's true. He was, in a sense, he was the father of ecology, okay? This is one of, if I can get this to work, yeah. This is one of my very first publications. It was published in 1969. It was from my PhD dissertation. When I looked at this morning and see that it's 1969, I didn't want to give you the wrong impression. I got my PhD when I was 8 years old, so. In this paper, what I suggested was that this equation should be examined. Now, the only thing that's important about this equation is this part of it. And those of you who can read math, you'll see that the important part of it is that ki minus ni minus the sum of ai, j, and j. That represents a linear transformation of the exponential process. The n's represent populations, and the I, the subscript represents the index of particular species, so that's a whole bunch of species that are interacting with one another. And so the proposition of the paper is that the interaction of species with one another is a very, very simple linear process, okay? And so what I found in this paper, what I reported in this paper, something that I don't believe, by the way, anymore, but did at the time, that indeed this equation was sufficient to describe ecological dynamics, at least to a first approximation, and we could proceed from there in looking at all the complicated details of that particular aspect of the equation. And all the stuff to the right of that red circle, the betas and the gammas and all those other Greek letters, represent nonlinear interactions. They represent higher order interactions that, what I was claiming, that to a first approximation we might be able to ignore. This allows us to view ecology as the great Ori, the universe operating in a clockwork fashion like Newton proposed it did, operating in a clockwork fashion like the Newtonians of the 17th century proposed and presume it did. And what we can do is we can take all the complexity and beauty and romanticism of nature, and we no longer have to look at it in this sort of mystical way, but we can actually transform it and view it in a Newtonian fashion. And that Newtonian clockwork universe then translates immediately into ecology, and that's the way we can view ecology. That was my view in 1969. And then later on in the 19th century, I became aware of this gentleman. Some of you probably recognize this as the great French mathematician Henri Poincaré. And Poincaré said, and I'll have to read this over here again, Poincaré said, of the many things he said, when he was talking about the three-body problem, three different masses, two different masses, the equations are pretty easy to solve, but when you get three masses together, this is what's classically referred to as the three-body problem, he said, it may happen that small differences in the initial conditions produce very great ones in the final phenomena. A small error in the former will produce an enormous error in the latter. Prediction becomes impossible. This was probably, I think this was probably one of the very first recognitions of the phenomena that we now know quite commonly as chaos in the world. So let me talk a little bit about the background, more of the mathematical background. We start with Mary Cartwright, who in the early part of the 20th century made some major mathematical incursions into the nature of forced oscillators. That becomes important for my work. And then the second, I'm not supposed to use the laser pointer because of the other room. This then is Alan Turing, the famous British mathematician who deciphered the Nazi code in World War II and who was driven to suicide by the homophobia rampant in the United Kingdom at the time. This gentleman is René Thom. Some of you remember him, who is not properly recognized, in my opinion, for major contributions which are, to this day, go not as well recognized as they should be in catastrophe theory. And finally, of course, Mandelbrot and the famous introduction of fractal geometry. Now, parallel with the, and I could have chosen other people, obviously, but I think these represent, for me at least, these represent major contributors to the general framework, the general ambiance of what I'm trying to talk about today. We have in ecology, we have 4 figures. Again, in my opinion, these are the 4 important figures, this being Rachel Carson, who, in addition to her important political statements about the use of pesticides and the environmental, negative environmental consequences of pesticides, she also was one of the very first to recognize the complexity and nonlinear nature of ecosystems and called our attention to the fact that this Newtonian worldview that many of us had was probably not correct. And then these two, this is Robert MacArthur and Richard Levins. The two of them together in the late 60s were pioneers in looking at the fundamental equations that we use in ecology and elaborating some of the needed complications, namely nonlinearity, stochasticity, spatial structure, that sort of thing. And finally, Lord May, Robert May from the UK, who is probably the most prolific ecology, theoretical ecologist that maybe that the world has ever known. I'm not sure. He's published an awful lot. It occurred to me as I looked at these pictures this morning when I was sort of going over this talk, there's 8 people that I identified, only 2 of which are women. And I think that my sort of excuse for doing that is this is history. I'm talking about history. This is the way it used to be, right? In biology now, in ecology especially, if I were to talk about who is important today, who is making the major contributions today in ecology, why at least half of them would be women. It just goes to show that we have made progress, I think, in gender equity in the sciences. Very few sciences I could imagine would show such a portrait like this without having a more balanced gender representation. A symposium like Saturday Morning Physics, for example, could never have something so biased as this. Just alert you to the fact that in case anybody's interested, the general ambiance that I'm trying to portray here was represented most elegantly by the BBC in this documentary that they showed just last year, in 2010, called Complexity, the Secret Life of Chaos. Now, the documentary is not just about chaos. Chaos, of course, is a technical term about the behavior of dynamic systems, and characterized by what Poincaré said about sensitive dependence on initial conditions leading to unpredictability, blah, 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 all of that. And some people have said, and I would agree, that it's unfortunate that we've decided to use the word chaos for this phenomenon, because chaos is a word that comes to us with a lot of baggage from our normal language. Actually, chaos is a technical term the way we come to use it now, and it's unfortunate that we call it chaos. On the other hand, you know, the Secret Life of Chaos is kind of a cool title. And, you know, the secret life of sensitive dependence on initial conditions leading to unpredictability. The secret life of sensitive conditions, well, that probably wouldn't be as popular. Okay, so that's the general framework in which I'm trying to operate here. It's what I might characterize, if I don't offend anybody, I hope, a post-Newtonian approach to ecological systems. So let me get to the actual research now, given that framework. The key question that we're concerned with is how these 4 potential pests are actually regulated in a coffee ecosystem. And now I'm talking about a coffee ecosystem that is largely not subjected to pesticides, chemical pesticides, all right? We have the 4 pests are the coffee berry borer, which is a very small beetle that bores into the coffee fruit and causes extensive damage. The green coffee scale, which is an insect that sticks its proboscis into the leaf of the coffee and sucks out the juices of the coffee. The coffee rust, which is a fungal disease, all these little yellow blotches are can you see that on the slide? Yeah. That's a fungal disease that attacks coffee, which is very important. I'll talk about that more in just a moment. And then the coffee leaf miner, which is a small lepidopteran, a small caterpillar that gets inside of the leaf and causes these little blotches on the leaf. Now, all of these pests are important in some areas of the world, but not necessarily in others. they tend to be less problematical in a more traditional way of doing coffee. That is, coffee with shade, no pesticides, coffee that's managed in a kind of an ecological fashion. The details of that are a little bit complicated, and I don't want to really talk about them, but the real point is, the key question here is, why is it that these potential pests that we know can be totally devastating in other parts of the world, why are they not so devastating where we work, in organic coffee in Mexico in particular? Now this devastation is not, it's not just in my mind, it is, and it's no kid stuff, really. In the 19th century, this particular disease is one of the most famous pests in the history of agriculture, actually. It attacked coffee production in Sri Lanka, what was then Ceylon, southern India, Sumatra, and Java, and it was so extensive that it actually destroyed coffee production entirely. I mean, you could become hyperbolous about the whole thing and talk about the Dutch Empire and the English Empire, the empires themselves being affected by this fungus. I guess I won't go that far, but the point is, it was strong enough, it was a big enough problem that farmers literally abandoned the production of coffee entirely. And indeed, that's one of the reasons we have so much coffee production in Latin America now, because it had to be abandoned in South Asia because of this disease. So these pests that I'm talking about can be extremely important pests. And our research, of course, is focused on why not. Okay, the first beetle story. This is the berry borer. I mentioned it already. It's a beetle. Here's the beetle right here, and it makes a hole in the coffee berry, and then the fungus gets in there and it just destroys the coffee berry. It can lead to severe reduction in production. This is a picture of it. It's very tiny right there, and there's the hole that it makes into the coffee berry. Okay, now part of the story has to do with the ant, all right? And I'm getting into the next story, the story of the ant. The first beetle story is about the pest. The next story, the story about the ant, is about the control of the pest. Now here we have, here's the ant. This is a coffee leaf. And there's the beetle that just flew in here and happened to land on this leaf as I came by with my camera. And so watch what happens. Is that going? Yeah. All right. So you all saw what happened, right? The ant is an important predator of that one particular pest. Here's another example here, and this is probably the more important one than if you put a beetle on a leaf and watch the ant take it away, which is, of course, what I did. It was a nature fake, all right? So this is what more normally happens, actually. When the beetle comes to a coffee seed like this one, why, you see the beetle with his rear end sticking out of the coffee berry right there. In order to get into the coffee berry, the beetle has to have about an hour. It takes about an hour to get all the way in. If she is sitting there with her rear end sticking out, and an ant comes along, especially this particular species of ant, if that ant comes along, the ant grabs it, pulls it out of the hole, and takes it off to the edge and throws it away, just like you saw the ant doing in the video I just showed you. So the ant is, and we've shown this, and there's lots of data on this right now to show that the ant is a very significant predator of this particular pest. So in a sense, we have the answer to our question, well, the ant does it, right? So the ant, Azteca instabilis, that's the name of it, by the way. Azteca instabilis, I'll just say Azteca from now on. That ant is a significant predator of one of the pests, and there we have one of the answers. But the ant is also associated in a mutualistic way with one of the other pests, the green coffee scale. Remember the green coffee scale? That's the thing that sucks the juices out of the leaf. So if it's mutualistically associated, that it has a positive effect on the green coffee scale, well, it helps one of the pests but eliminates the other pests. So how do we actually deal with that? Well, first of all, let's look at that relationship. Here's a picture. This is the same picture I showed you a moment ago with the scale insects are all over here, and these are the ants protecting the scale insect. What happens is the scale insect, which is here, this is a big blow-up of scale insect, produces a substance called honeydew. You can see right here, I don't know if you can see it from back there, I hope you can. There's a little bubble right there. That's a drop of honeydew that ant has just collected from that scale insect. So the ants run around collecting this honeydew. It's basically sugar water. It's filled with carbohydrates that the ants need for the energy source. So the ants run around like crazy, and while they're running around like crazy, they scare away all the potential predators of the scale insect. So the scale insect would normally be attacked by parasitoids and predators and things that come to get it, but as long as the ants are there crawling around on top of it, nothing can get at it. The ants simply scare everything away. They will take, like they took the beetle, like that one ant you saw take the beetle and throw it away. They'll do that with wasps. They'll do that with other kind of predators, with other beetle predators, etc. So what we have here is a system. We can, and this is, I'm going to get back to this a little later, so I want to spend a little bit of time on this. We have the Azteca that eats the berry borer, right? And then we have the parasitoids or parasites or predators, if you like, that eat the scale insects. And then we additionally, we have the scale insects that provide the honeydew to the ants, to the Azteca. Now I want to change the way that looks just a little bit. Did you see what I did there? Let me go back and do it again, because you're supposed to see, this is supposed to be really obvious. And the last time I did this, people said it wasn't obvious, okay? I'm just changing the position of this to make the diagram that I want to make sense, okay? So I'm not changing anything about the real dynamics of what's going on there, just changing the diagram. Get rid of the pictures, move this over a little bit like that. And the reason I do that is because I want to put this little blue line in there, all right? So what we have here is the black connectors. The arrowheads represent the positive effect. The little black circles represent a negative effect. So the parasitoid, for example, has a negative effect on the scale insect. The scale insect has a positive effect on the predator, of course, because it's giving it energy. The Azteca has a negative effect on the berry borer. The berry borer has a positive effect on the Azteca because it's giving it energy. Those black lines represent a direct effect. On the other hand, this little blue line here with the little negative ball on the end of it, that represents what we refer to as an indirect trait-mediated effect. And that indirect trait-mediated effect has nothing to do with giving or taking energy. What it has to do with is modifying the behavior of something. So the ants modify the behavior of the parasitoid so that the parasitoid cannot get at the scale insect. The ants effectively reduce the ability of the parasitoid to attack the scale insect. And that kind of effect is going to be really important in the rest of this lecture. So I hope that I get that point across, what that little blue circle means. Okay? So let me go on from there. We have the green coffee scale now. Let me talk a little bit more about that. In this left-hand part of the slide here, we have a picture that I took in Puerto Rico where the scale actually frequently does gain pest status and reduces production of coffee to about 30 or 40%, sometimes, not always, but sometimes. And here's a picture I took in Mexico where we work, and this is a coffee leaf which is pretty free. This whole coffee plant was free of scales except for that one right there. You see it? No, of course you don't. But you can see that the arrow is pointing to it. Okay, how come it's a pest sometimes and not a pest in other times? Well, one thing is because the ants. When the ants are there, they're protected against their predators. But what is that predator that they're protecting against? And in this particular case, it happens to be this. This is the second beetle I'm going to talk about, the lady beetle. Actually, somebody noted that it does kind of look like an alien, doesn't it? It's a very tiny beetle. It sort of looks bigger in the slide, but you can tell you know what a coffee bean looks like. It's a very small beetle, and it's a voracious predator of the scale insects. Now, it has a larva, and the larva looks like this. Now, the larva is a totally different critter. The larva the adult flies, of course, like most beetles do. The larva doesn't fly, and the larva has all these white protuberances on here. Okay, keep that in mind. You're going to see what that means in just a second. So we have the whole picture here. We have the adults. We have two larvae on this leaf right here. And all along here, we have the scale insects. Okay, and those are the scale insects that this larva and this adult are actually eating at the present time, right while I'm taking this picture, okay? Now, the thing about the relationship between this beetle and the ant turns out to be super important because here's a picture of Azteca instabilis attacking an adult lady beetle. And actually, I rather like this slide. I always point this out because here's all the ants attacking the beetle here. Does that show up okay there? Yeah. And up here, this is the ringleader. See? He's saying, onward, onward, she. Anyway, that's not really true, but sort of looks that way. Anyway, when an adult beetle lands on the plant, and if there's ants around, when the ants swarm around it, they attack it, and the beetle has to drop off the plant. Sometimes the beetle doesn't drop off fast enough, and the ants actually grab it and they kill it. But most of the time, the beetle will actually escape. However, the ants are unable to attack the larvae of the lady beetle because of those little white protuberances. Here's an ant that made the mistake of trying to attack it. And what happens is her mandibles are absolutely filled and all gummed up with this waxy-like substance that the beetle larvae has. And so the beetle larvae is protected against the ants, protected from the ant attack by these little waxy substances that it has all over its body, right? Now, the thing that's important about this, well, several things important, but for this talk, the thing that's important about it is that parasites attack the lady beetle. Now, in this slide, you see here, this is a pupa of the same lady beetle. It's very, very tiny now. This is a big blow-up. And what you can see are these three holes. Those are exit holes where this parasitoid right here, it's a small parasitic wasp, has exited from this cocoon here, okay? Now, the thing is, the ants, like I said before, the ants are running around on top of the scale insects, chasing away all the parasitoids from the scale insects, right? Well, if the parasitoids of the beetle now arrives to try to get at the beetle, the ants are just scaring away everything, right? So the ants effectively protect the beetle from its own parasitoids. So the ants being there is a great place for the beetle larvae because, first of all, that's where all the scale insects are, so all its food is there. But second of all, the ants protect the beetle from all the parasitoids that are trying to attack it. So what we have here, you remember this graph now. I'm going to add to this graph. We have the beetle and the parasitoids acting on the beetle. And then we have the Azteca actually having this indirect, again, an indirect trait-mediated effect on the parasitoids that are attacking the beetle. So the Azteca has this strong negative effect against the adults, but it actually has an indirect positive effect for the larvae. So we come to the conclusion that the ants are unable to attack the larvae of the lady beetle, but they inadvertently protect the larvae from its natural enemies. And we have the situation then where the adults are only able to survive when the ants are not there, and the larvae are only able to survive when the ants are there. I forgot to mention that and we've done studies on this, when the larvae occur absent the ants, their survival rate is almost zero. They go down very low because they get attacked by those very parasitoids, and the predators too. Okay, so the adults can only survive without the ants, and the larvae can only survive with the ants, which means that we need this logical impossibility, an environment that has both with and without ants. And the next question is, how can that be? Which leads us to the second story of the ant. So this is the farm on which we work, a picture of it. Here I am, if you want me for scale. That's me standing right there, so you can get an idea of what the farm looks like. The ant in question is Azteca instabilis. And if you can see right here on my computer, it's pretty obvious, but maybe the slides aren't that obvious. But right there and right there are big sort of extensions. What the Azteca does, it nests inside of these big shade trees. But when the nest gets really big, lots and lots of workers, well, it actually creates additions to its nest, right? There's a little carton nest similar to what you see in a wasp nest or something like that. That's what this example is. Now, these ants that live inside of this big shade tree, why, what they do is they forage on these coffee bushes around here. This is my colleague at Perfecto providing scale for this slide. So the ants actually forage all around here, and this down here on these coffee bushes are where the scale insects are that they have a mutualistic association with, right? So in order to study this, these ants are actually fairly rare when you look at the landscape as a whole. And back in 2003, we started working on this particular species, and we couldn't find it, basically. It was hard to figure out where it was. So we set up a large plot to do a systematic survey of all of the trees to figure out where all of the nests were. We set out a plot of 45 hectares. Now, I want to emphasize how big 45 hectares is. This is central campus of the University of Michigan, right there. And if you put our plot on Central Campus, it would look something like this, okay? Now, it's really big. This is the Nat Sci building where my office is, and here's Dennison over here. It doesn't take that long to walk over there, but don't forget, we're in incredibly mountainous terrain here. So if you look here where I'm standing, I took this picture, and if you look all the way over here, there's a line of trees on the top of that ridge over there. That's the other end of the plot. So I'm in one end of the plot over here, and I took a picture. You can see where the other end of the plot is over there. To get from one end of the plot to the other end of the plot, it takes about an hour walking on trails, okay? So we set out that really big plot. I want to emphasize how big 45 hectares is and how much work this was. We set up the 45-hectare plot, and we censused all of the shade trees, not the coffee trees, all of the shade trees on the plot. These are the places where the ants might live, okay? And this is what all the shade trees look like. There are 11,000 of them in that plot. You don't try to count them, but there are 11,000, I guarantee. And then when we look at which of the trees actually contain the ant nests, this is the distribution of the ant nests. I've taken in this particular picture, I made all the trees themselves. All of the trees are sort of grayish, and then I put the trees with the ant nests in them in black. Now what you can see is there's a very non-random distribution of the ant nests, and they tend to occur in these clumps. Here's a clump here, here's a clump here, or clusters. Here's a cluster here, and a cluster here. So the question arose is how come they exist in these clusters? Now remember I said at the beginning that the way this whole thing is set up, it's a relatively monotonous ecosystem. It's meant to be that way. It's an agricultural ecosystem, right? So there's nothing obvious. Indeed, I think we can pretty much show that there's no background information which causes this clump to be there or that clump to be there. They could equally be over here where they're not, okay? So the question arises is what causes those clumps? And that's where we get to the insights of Alan Turing. Alan Turing's insights about diffusive instabilities become important for us here. At least this is the way I interpret what's happening in nature. The idea of the diffusive instability, Alan Turing talked about the, well, I don't know how to explain this really quickly, and I just looked at my time here. I haven't been talking for 58 minutes, have I? Oh, okay. Oh, I had this on before. That's why. So I'm totally, I don't know how long I've been talking. Anyway, so Alan Turing, he had this idea, if you have a diffusive system, so that, you know, it's like a drop of ink in an aquarium, it diffuses out and just becomes all gray like that. But if it's an active system, such that you have a chemical reaction going on, and that chemical reaction is producing some sort of chemical substance, why then you can imagine a system where that chemical substance, you put the drop in the aquarium and it starts out red, let's say, and just becomes red all over and gets even more red. So it's an activating process. But then if the reaction, he said, if the reaction produces another reactant that's a suppressor of that first reactant, and it's dependent on the concentration of the first reactant, well, what you effectively have is you have an activator, that first reactant, and then a repressor, the second one. The point of all that is that in a chemical system, and this now is well established that it really does occur, in a chemical system, if the rate of diffusion of one of the chemicals is larger than the rate of diffusion of the other, that is, if the rate of diffusion of the repressor is larger than the rate of diffusion of the activator, what you get is you get a blotchy picture. That is, you get a clustered distribution of those two chemicals. Okay, taking that as a metaphor, what we propose is that what happens with these ants is when an ant colony gets big, it's inside of that tree. Whoops, I didn't mean to go there. The ant colony is inside of the tree. When it gets really big, the ants have to go somewhere else because they're too big and they can make those little carton nests I showed you, but they also sometimes have to leave. Now, it's a multiple queen species, so what happens is a queen takes a bunch of workers with her and she goes and she colonizes another tree. And then when she finishes and gets really, really big in that tree, she goes and colonizes another tree. So in this process, you have one tree here, and then you get a neighboring tree, and a neighboring tree, and a neighboring tree, and a neighboring tree. Obviously, you create a cluster of trees, right? So the ant acts, in this big spatial sense, the ant acts as kind of an activator in the Turing sense. However, as Alan Turing would point out, well, all that's going to result in is that all of the trees are going to be occupied by the ants. You have to have some repressor, right? So the question is, what might act as a repressor? And here there's another piece of the story that is incredibly important. And that piece is this organism right here. This is a fly. It's in the order Diptera. It's a fly, and it's a parasitoid against the ant. Here you see it trying to attack this ant right here. What the fly does, the fly comes in, attacks the ant, puts an egg right in the base of the head capsule of the ant. That egg hatches, the larva goes into the head capsule, basically eats out all the stuff in the head. So imagine a fly in there eating your brain out, for example. And then what happens, at the time, just about the time the fly is ready to emerge, the ant's head falls off. That's why it's called, these are called decapitating flies for that reason. And here's a nice shot of a head. This is an ant head right here. And there's the little fly coming out of the ant head that has detached from its body, okay? These flies are in the family Phoridae. I'll probably say Phoridae, P-H-O-R-I-D-A-E. They're phorid flies, and they're well known to attack a variety of different species of ants. Well, we discovered that there's a phorid that attacks our ant species. And to make a long story short, we did the studies to show that the phorid attacks more when there's a bigger cluster of ant nests. So what happens is your ant nest, when it's isolated, doesn't get attacked very much by the phorid, but as you build up the local density of nests, why the odor of the ants in that area apparently is detectable by the phorids, and the phorids themselves build up in that area, thereby acting as the Turing repressor, so to speak. So we have the Azteca instabilis, and this phorid, which is, the genus is Suractian. You don't have to remember that, obviously, but the phorid is there attacking it. So the model we propose is you start with a nest, you get more nests, but those nests then, they start smelling. The ants give off, oh, when I say start smelling, I literally mean that. Ants give out an odor, right? They're called pheromones. And that odor then is detected by the phorids, which then come in and attack the ants. So what we did was we built a simple toy model about the whole thing. It's a cellular automata based on those basic principles. I'm not going to explain the details of it, but it's published if you'd like to see it. And these are two different representations of the field data that we got from 2 different years. This was 2004 and 2005. And using the parameters that we estimated from the field, why these are the simulations. These are just snapshots of the simulation. They're very dynamic in time. And as you see, at a qualitative level, why the model reproduces more or less what the pattern looks like. So we have this model system, and it reproduces more or less what the pattern looks like. And indeed, it does pretty well at predicting overall. Here, we published this in Nature in 2008, based on this notion of robust criticality, which I'm not going to bother to explain, but this is the very first time that anybody's observed robust criticality in nature. At least that's our claim. And here are the data. There are two runs of the computer here, the black one and the gray run here. And these lines here represent the actual field data. And as you can see, the computer runs track the field data reasonably well. But I want to emphasize that this graph goes from 0 to what? To 800. Remember, I said there were 11,000 trees in the system. So this y-axis actually should range from 0 to 11,000, at which point you wouldn't be able to really see the difference between the computer output and the actual distribution we saw in the field, okay? So what we're confident is that we have a system where, remember we had the problem with the adults and the larvae of the beetle? Well, we are confident now that the adults survive in patches where the ants are not, which is most of the area, by the way, and the larvae survive in patches when the ants are there. And all important is that the patches come from this basic dynamic process operating in space, what we refer to as a Turing process or a Turing-like process at least, okay? So now we add to our system here that effect of the phorid, and remember that This can only happen in a spatially distributed system. If you, I mean, theoretically, if you mix it all up, it doesn't work. It has to happen in a system that has a geometry in it, you know, a spatial component to the whole thing. Okay, now this brings up another question. Remember the ants and how the ants are affecting the beetles. Now, it's true that the larvae have to be where the ants are. Now, if you're a female beetle, you want your babies then to be where the ants are, right? But you can't get to where the ants are. And furthermore, you can't just sneak in there and lay an egg because the ants eat beetle eggs like crazy. If you put an egg anywhere on the tree where the ants are there, the ants are going to eat it. So this brings up the question, what do you do? If you're a female, you want your babies to be there, well, you have to somehow hide them from the ants. Well, what the beetles do, most amazingly, we just discovered this recently, what the beetles do is they sneak in, and this slide, you probably can't interpret it unless I tell you, but this is a microscopic view of a scale insect right here, turned on its back, and right here you can see those are 3 beetle eggs right there. What she does, she comes in there and she lifts the scale insect up and she oviposits right under the scale, which is a great idea, you see, because the ants won't get at it because the ants don't even know it's there, but when the beetle larvae hatches, it's right there where all the babies of the scale insect are. So it has its food source right there. Isn't that cool? Okay, but it's cooler because there's another problem, okay? Here, check this out. This is really, can you see that slide? Can you see that video? Those are ants, all right? Now, you got to imagine, if you're a beetle, imagine that each one of those is a T-Rex, okay? And you are down there trying to have a baby in those, amongst those. Wouldn't that be hard? And that's pretty much what it is, okay? Now, what happens here, and this is the really cool part, what happens is there's this behavioral response that these ants have. They sting like crazy too, by the way. There's a behavioral response that these ants have when the phorid fly comes. Remember, the phorid fly is trying to get an egg right there. So what the ant does is the ant goes like that and puts his head back so the fly can't get there, you know? And so the ant sort of adopts this posture like this, right? Now, it turns out that the phorid fly can't find the ant unless the ant moves. It's sort of like the way I think of, you know, you probably know, well, I don't know about women's locker rooms, but men's locker rooms really smell bad. And so even if you had really, really foggy lenses on and you couldn't see anything, when you enter a men's locker room, you pretty much know you're in the locker room from the odor, right? Probably women's are the same, but like I say, I don't know. Now, if what you want to do is you have a wet towel and you want to snap somebody with the wet towel, you want to do something to some individual, you know, with your foggy lenses on there, you know you're in the locker room, but you can't find the individual. When the individual moves, because your lenses are just foggy, you can see the individual move. Well, that's the same thing that happens with these phorids. They can get to where the ants are, but they cannot oviposit unless the ant moves. And I have this video I want to show you now, which is really great. This is an ant. This is a setup in the laboratory, okay? So we have ants and phorids in these insect cages in the laboratory. Here's an ant, and that ant has adopted this catatonic position. And here is a phorid fly trying to find it, okay? Now remember, the phorid fly knows it's there because there's an odor. The ant has an odor. The pheromone odor is always there. But the phorid now is waiting for the motion. Now watch. Watch what happens. Can you see it? See? I know there's an ant there. I know there's an ant there. But note, the ant won't move at all. The ant's just not moving. See that? Now, even when the phorid goes away, the ant stays still. So there's the phorid again. The phorid is now going to go in another part of the cage, but the ant just stays still. Now the phorid will come back. The ant is not moving at all. Now watch the phorid come back. I think he comes back. Yeah, there it is. It still knows there's an ant there. I mean, the odor's there. It's in the locker room, but nobody's moving. So it doesn't know what to do. See that? Isn't that awesome? That's incredible. So anyway, that's what happens. Now, now here's a photo of, this is not a nature fake, okay? That other one was a nature fake. It was in the laboratory. This one actually happened. But what you see here, there's a phorid right there. And see the position of the ants? They all have that posture. Now, what's really important here is it's not just these ants that are right where the forehead is, but it's all these ants that have that posture. Right? So what happens is when the forehead comes, obviously the ants communicate with one another, and they say, look out, forehead. Now, the way they say that is with a pheromone. Ants don't talk, but they do talk with pheromones. And so the ant lets out a pheromone that's very, very specific that says, there is a forehead parasitoid around, assume your position. Okay? Really, that really happens. So now we have these two types of ant behavior here. We have the behavior where they're in their catatonic position and not moving, or we have the behavior where you have all those T-Rexes running around and you have to have your baby up there. So when does the female decide to lay her eggs? Okay, when the forehead comes, that's right. Okay, so that's pretty obvious. Here's another example. This is just a sort of a side shot of the same thing, but you see those ants just sitting there at attention, you know? It's really amazing when you see that. They're just all there at attention. And when you see ants like that, you can be sure. Just look for a little while and you'll see a forehead right there. Now, the final kicker for this story of this particular ant and beetle, I'm on the second beetle story, I guess, or this is the second ant story, whoops, is if you take this apparatus, this is an apparatus we built in the field. This is an insect cage and that's an insect cage. The two insect cages, this is an olfactometer, which is basically just a chamber that's receiving air from that insect cage and air from that insect cage. This is an air pump that's pumping air out of the chamber. So what you create is you create a gradient in here from that side to that side, and you can then do experiments at different kinds of odors in this cage versus this cage. And so if you put in this cage an ant nest with foreheads around, and in this cage an ant nest with no foreheads around, and then you put beetles in here and ask what the beetles do, you can tell how the beetles are responding to that particular pheromone that the ant uses when the forehead is around, okay? And what's amazing about this, I won't show you the data, but I'll just tell you what the data say. The male beetles don't respond at all. Male beetles either don't recognize that special pheromone or don't care. Female beetles, prior to copulation, don't recognize it either. But female beetles that are pregnant, that is, female beetles that have been copulated with, they recognize that pheromone. They recognize the specific pheromone of the ant saying, look out, there's foreheads around, for fairly obvious reasons. So what that implies in this graph now, in this diagram, the theoretical consequences of this are really quite spectacular in my view, at least. What that means is this forehead is having that trait-mediated effect, but is really a trait-mediated effect against trait-mediated effects. So what you have here is you have the forehead negatively affects the Azteca's ability to negatively affect the parasite's ability to attack the scale insect. This is what we refer to as cascading trait-mediated effects. And they are, we think that they're probably very common in the natural world, although ecologists have not studied them hardly at all. As a matter of fact, I think this is the first time that they've been reported in the literature. I could be wrong, but I think so. Now, just a brief theoretical interlude here. I wanted to point out that what we have here is in a theoretical level is we have the natural enemies, consumers of the ants, and then we have the ants. And we have the natural enemies or the consumers of the hemipterans, that is the scale insects. And we have the hemipterans, the scale insects here. And of course, the hemipterans and the ants are positively related to one another through that mutualism, right? So we have a positive-negative relationship here, a positive-negative relationship here, and a positive-positive relationship here. Now, the basic ecological equations for this tell us that this is an oscillating system, and this is an oscillating system. So we have two oscillators, or two oscillating systems, that are connected with one another. So what we have in abstract principle, we have coupled oscillators. Now, coupled oscillators are, have been a topic in physics for many, many years. I'm sure most everybody here knows that. So more abstractly, we have the same picture in B that we had in A, with consumer 1 and resource 1 is an oscillating system. Consumer 2 and resource 2 is an oscillating system. And they're coupled together by that phenomenon of mutualism. Now, another way to look at this, the mathematics of this is fairly obvious, and we've done that mathematics, and And it's interesting in and of itself. But if you want to get more precise about it and you want to expand this little toy model a little bit, what's really happening here with if you dissect the mutualism, the scale insect is giving energy to the ant, that's true, but the ant is actually having a trait-mediated effect on the ability of the scale insect's predators to actually attack. So that's trait-mediated, I call that T1. And then you have the phorid has this T2 effect, the trait-mediated 2 effect. In other words, the phorid negatively affects the ant's ability to negatively affect the parasite's ability to attack the scale insect, right? So what you have here, I mean, think about this mathematically. For those of you who are interested in the mathematics of it, you have two oscillating systems with a fairly complicated way of coupling them together. And that way of coupling them together leads to some fairly interesting behavior. I won't say more about that, but anybody who wants to email me about that, I'd be happy to share those results with you. Now, let's get back to the historical devastation, finally, here. This was, you recall this, the coffee rust. A little bit of the history. I mean, like I said before, Sri Lanka, South India, Java, and Sumatra were absolutely devastated. And that's why part of the reason coffee came to America, so the arrival of coffee in America, then the arrival of coffee rust in Brazil shortly thereafter, and the arrival of paranoia in Central America and Mexico right after that. I was in Central America and Mexico when that happened, and you saw signs like this all over the place. This says coffee farmer, prepare yourself for the arrival of the coffee rust, prune your plants, get rid of your shade, and fertilize your plants like crazy, okay? Now, none of those things have any basis in science, okay? Really, none whatsoever. Some agronomists said that that must be what you should do. I don't know why. But they have no basis in science whatsoever. I've reviewed that literature, and that was a total nonsense, okay? Now, it turns out that it was a false problem. Even where nobody did anything, like the farm that we work on, the rust never really became the devastating problem in Mesoamerica that it was in Asia. It's a problem, don't get me wrong. It is a problem, but something maintains it somehow below the level where it becomes a devastating problem. Why does it not become the problem then? And that's part of our research. And just a story, to make a long story short, it has to do with the green coffee scale again. Now, this is the story, the last story, the story of the fungus. The green coffee scale gets attacked by a fungal disease. This is the fungal disease. As you can see, there's a little white halo around the scale insect here in both this picture and this picture. You can see those little white halos. That's a fungal, well, that's fungal mycelium. That's the body of the fungus, basically, and those scales are dead. It's a disease of the scale insects that's caused by this fungus, Leccanicilium lecanii, and the disease itself is called the white halo fungus disease. Now, it turns out that this disease attacks the scale insects. And remember, it's one of those epidemiological problems. The fungal never attacks unless you have a lot of scales. It's like any kind of epidemiological system. The density of the host population says whether the disease can actually spread through the population or not. So the fungus only attacks the scales when they're densely populated, which they only are when they're under protection of the ants. So it's all connected to the ants again. But the really interesting thing here now is that the white halo fungus, Leccanicilium lecanii, which is right here, is also, as you can see here, eating the coffee rust. This yellow material right here, that's coffee rust, and this is Leccanicilium lecanii on top of the coffee rust eating it away. So what you have is you have this antagonistic relationship, or it's actually, the Leccanicilium is a fungal disease of the fungal rust, okay? And indeed, what the picture I initially showed you, you can see all these little white specks, all these little white spots up there. That is Leccanicilium lecanii attacking the coffee rust. So this is, we argue, the evidence is relatively strong that this acts as a controller. It doesn't completely wipe it out by any means, but it acts as a moderating influence against the coffee rust. So to this graph now that I've been slowly building up throughout this talk, we have to add the white halo fungus, which attacks the scale insect, but then also attacks the coffee rust in the system, right? Okay, so now I've built up this, and I've showed you all this, and I don't know if I mentioned this, but we have, you know, solid empirical data, experiments and everything to show that all of these relationships exist. Now, if I really did have the 3 hours that I asked for, but they wouldn't give me, I would tell you about the rest of the system, okay? But I can't, so you're just going to have to take it on faith that this is the rest of the system. All right? And indeed, all of those things are there, and it's still just a part of the system, okay? But it's there. And all of those things taken together really are that's the reason that those pests, or we argue, that's the reason that those pests never reach pest status, or I shouldn't say never. That's the reason that they're kept under relative control, at least, okay? So when somebody asks me the question, what keeps the pests under control? I ask you, what keeps the pests under control? Yeah, whatever you said. I say autonomous biological control through ecological complexity, or more properly stated, autonomous biological control through non-Newtonian ecological complexity, okay? Now, in case you're interested in, this is the point that we made in a recent paper that we published, in bioscience, and I would like to read the abstract of this because the abstract says what I want to say. Many traditional farmers and environmentalists subscribe to the popular idea that the natural world offers ecosystem services that contribute to the stability, productivity, and sustainability of agriculture. Opponents of this view argue that the farm is not an environment to be stewarded by romantic environmentalists, but rather is a battlefield on which the enemies of production must be vanquished. Contemporary research in ecosystem complexity offers a new platform on which to adjudicate between these two points of view. Through particular network structuring, nonlinearity, and stochasticity, and especially with the added dimension of space, recent theoretical and empirical research reveals that ecological systems persist and generate ecosystem services as a result of complex interacting components. Here we report on our research into the ecological dynamics of a collection of species related to key problems in pest control, a critical ecosystem service in coffee production. And that pretty much summarizes what I wanted to say. This is our research crew from last summer. Thank you to everybody, all of them, and thank you for listening to me.